Continue studying along the lines of the idea of judgment, and the sermon the title tonight is Weighed in the Balances of God. Now, many people who probably know little to nothing about the Babylonians or about Belshazzar's feast or Daniel's prophecies are familiar with the phrase, the handwriting on the wall. And that phrase actually comes here from Daniel chapter 5, and it basically means it's an announcement of the impending judgment that's coming upon a person. And so as you go back in Daniel chapter 5, you'll see, first of all, remember the feast that Belshazzar made. Remember the disrespect that he showed toward God by bringing out the Jewish holy vessels and drinking wine from them. And from that point on, in the same hour, the Bible tells us, the same hour in which he was drinking out of those Jewish holy cups, a hand appears and a finger writes a message upon the wall. Now, the countenance, the Bible tells us that the physical countenance of Belshazzar immediately changes. Remember how he's out here, he's throwing this party to basically show people how great that he is and how great his empire is. And, you know, he wants everybody to be jealous of him and how big of a man he is. He immediately changes in appearance. And the Bible says he's terrified. He literally couldn't even stand up whenever he saw that finger and the message that was written upon the wall. But there was a problem because nobody understood the message that was written. And so in true Babylonian fashion, Belshazzar calls for all the wise men of Babylon to try to interpret the handwriting on the wall for him. And when none of those people could do it, guess who comes to the rescue once again? Well, Daniel. And so we have to understand, Daniel basically tells him this is a message from God. The message from God is he has weighed you in his balances and you have come up short. You are found wanting or lacking. And the truth of the matter is all of us one day are going to be weighed in the spiritual balances of God. Tonight we want to look at some things that God will weigh within our lives whenever that judgment day comes. And they're based upon some of the things that we read about and study about here in Daniel chapter 5. So let's consider some of the things that are going to be looked at in our lives whenever we're weighed in those spiritual balances. The first thing that I want to point out from this chapter is, one of the things that's going to be considered is our reputation. And when you look at Daniel had a tremendous reputation, even though he lived in a foreign country. And even though most of those people were not of the same religious mindset that he was, yet there was a good reputation that he maintained within that society. And it's interesting to me as you keep reading about Daniel, there's this phrase that recurs throughout it, this idea of him having the spirit of the holy God. And it's said through several times in this chapter. It's also mentioned back in the dreams of Nebuchadnezzar that were interpreted there. But actually in verse 12 is what I want us to concentrate on and to think about, also verse 11. And this was a statement that was made by the queen to Belshazzar. Now, the queen is an interesting character to me. If we have a little bit of time, we might talk a little bit more about her. But she makes this comment to Belshazzar about Daniel. It says, "Forasmuch as an excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams and showing of hard sentences and dissolving doubts were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show thee the interpretation." Now remember, all these wise men could not interpret this handwriting on the wall. And so the queen comes to Belshazzar and she says, "There is a man within our kingdom who has a reputation for being able to interpret dreams." She describes Daniel as having an excellent spirit. And she goes on to basically tell us that what that means. It meant that he had knowledge. It meant that he had understanding. It meant that he was gifted in interpreting. It meant that he was able to show the hard sayings or sentences. And he was able to dissolve doubts within the minds of men. If you go to verse 11, back up to verse 11, here she is again talking about Daniel. But she says, "There is a man in thy kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods." That's an interesting phrase to me because I think the New King James actually translates it, the spirit of the holy God, implying she thought it was Jehovah God. Well, that idea isn't there in the original languages, but the idea of having a different spirit is. And she knew there was something different about Daniel. It was his disposition. It was the way that he would conducted himself. It was his knowledge and his understanding and his abilities that he had. He had an excellent spirit. And she likened it to being like what we would consider, or they would have considered in that day, a person who had the spirit of the gods. It was like he was imitating or being like a god would be like. And so again, she talks a little bit about him. She said, in the days of thy father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, thy father, the king, I say, thy father, made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. So you have this idea that Daniel was a person who, in her mind and estimation, was in touch with the gods. And that's one of the things that we're going to have to think about. Do people see our relationship to God in our lives? You know, people could look at Daniel and see that he had a relationship with God. Are we in touch with God? Do we resemble the Spirit of our God? You know, as Christians, our goal is to imitate our Father. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to be like God. And when people looked at Daniel, they saw that resemblance. They saw that likeness of one in whom is the Spirit of God. And so that's one of the things that's going to be considered. How much were we like the Spirit of our God? The second thing that I want to talk about is, did we have a good name? And obviously, again, you read about Daniel here. Daniel is a man who had a good name, even though he was a captive in a foreign country. The wise man tells us in Proverbs 22 and verse 1, a good name is rather to be chosen than great riches, and loving favor rather than silver and gold. As human beings, we often assign value to things that really aren't that valuable. When we think about the statement here that the wise man made, he said, a good name is rather to be chosen than great riches. Not just riches, but great riches. So think about this choice. If you had the choice here tonight, either you can choose to have a good reputation, or you can choose to be filthy rich. Which choice would you make? Well, as a human, we would think that money would do us a lot of good, right? And maybe I can work on my reputation a little bit better after I get that money. But you know what God values? You know where true value is? It's not in dollars and cents. It's not in gold and silver. It's in having a good name among the people. God values a good name much more than great riches. That word name, of course, that doesn't have to do with our physical name. It doesn't have to do with whether you're named Adam or Moses or Abraham or anybody else like that, or Job. But it has to do with the idea of our character. What are we known for? A good reputation. And as a Christian, a good reputation is something that is priceless. Now, I know we often say, and it is true, you know, you can't hold the past against somebody. And that's true. There's no way you can, as a Christian, when somebody repents of that and changes their way, it doesn't really matter what you've done in the past. But you also have to remember this, and this is just a smart teaching of the Bible, a wise teaching of the Bible. You can't erase the past either. Sometimes, no matter what you say and what you do, you have to carry that with you the rest of your life. And we need to be mindful of that, especially as Christians, because we can easily do something or easily say something that can dramatically change our reputation among men, and we could carry that reputation for the rest of our lives. But Daniel did have a good reputation. I mentioned the queen here. She's an interesting character to me because if you remember back in the story in verse 2, all of the king's wives and concubines are at the feast, but the queen is not. Now, what does that tell me? That tells me that this is probably not the wife of Belshazzar. I would say this is probably the queen mother. It might even be the queen grandmother. But it is interesting to me that she is not among all these people who are drinking themselves, you know, in a drunken stupor. She didn't have anything to do with that. When she comes, she has to be called in order to come before the king, which again indicates she was not at the party. But she also speaks very rationally. Her mind hasn't been dulled by alcohol. She's in her right mind. She's in her right senses. And she's able to give accurate and useful information to the king himself. And so she was a person who was very familiar with the man Daniel. And Daniel had a good reputation in her estimation. He was a person who resembled the gods, the spirit of the gods. He had a good name. But we also learned this in this story. Even though he had this kind of reputation among the queen, Belshazzar had no idea who Daniel was. In fact, if you look in this very same chapter, in verse 13 here of Daniel chapter 5, it says, Then was Daniel brought in before the king, and the king spake and said unto Daniel, Art thou Daniel, which are of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry? Well, he didn't have any idea who Daniel was. He didn't recognize him by his physical appearance. He did know a little bit about his history, and I think that's based largely upon what the queen relayed to him. But he does point this out about Daniel. He asked him the question, Are you Daniel, in verse 13. In verse 14, he says, I have even heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. And now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known unto me the interpretation thereof, but they could not show the interpretation of the thing. Notice verse 16. And I have heard of thee, that thou canst make interpretations and dissolve doubts. Now if thou canst read the writing and make known to me the interpretation thereof, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet and have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shalt be the third ruler in the kingdom. Although the king didn't know Daniel personally, he had heard about Daniel. Daniel had a reputation with the king, and that reputation was a good one based upon what the queen had told him. Now remember, Daniel's name, whenever he went into captivity, Daniel's name was actually changed. It was very similar to the king's name. It was Belteshazzar. The king's name is Belshazzar. So pretty similar, but a little bit different in and of themselves. But even though his name had been changed, his true identity, who he truly was, could not be concealed. And so people knew Daniel not by his Babylonian name, but they knew him by his character. Sometimes when we talk about a good name or a good reputation, sometimes people will tell you something about other people, and it turns out not to be true. You ever had that happen before? Now that works both ways. Sometimes they tell you some very positive things about an individual, how good of a person they are, how helpful they are, and it turns out that person is nothing like what they were built up or hyped up to be. Sometimes they tell you very bad things about a person, how wicked or evil and how rude a person is, but it turns out to be exactly the opposite. What people tell us about other people is not always true. But the reason that he had heard this about Daniel, the reason that he believed this about Daniel, is because what the queen said about Daniel was true. Daniel wasn't, it wasn't just who the queen thought Daniel was, it was who Daniel really was. He wasn't trying to put on a good front, wasn't trying to pull the wool over people's eyes into believing he was a type of person that he was not. And so he had a good name, especially among the queen. In 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 7, the Bible emphasizes the importance of a good name or a reputation. Now, it's actually talking about the office of an elder here, but in verse 7 it says this, Moreover, he must have a good report of them which are without, lest he fall into reproach and the snare of the devil. All of us need to make sure that our reputation is what it should be. And the reason why is this, whether we like it or not, well, what other people think of us, and especially people outside of the church, people within the world, what people think of us is important. Because in large part, it's going to determine what kind of influence, or if we are going to have any influence within their life. And so if we have a bad reputation, the chances are that we're not going to have much influence upon that person. The Bible says a good name is priceless. It's greater than silver and gold. And so we need to put that up on the high priority part of our list whenever we think about being a Christian. Another thing, though, that God is going to consider whenever he weighs us in the spiritual balances is the idea that we think that age was just a number. We read a little bit about Daniel here, and I say this a lot as we go through these stories. We're only 5 chapters into the book of Daniel, and in my mind, Daniel should be 22 years old. That's just the way that I think as a human, because I haven't gone very far in this story. But the reality of it is that Daniel is a very well-aged man at this point in time. And one thing that we all know as humans upon this earth, age is going to affect each one of us. It's interesting when we read back about Daniel there in Daniel 5 and verse 12, the queen talks about how he had that excellent spirit, that knowledge, that understanding, how he was able to interpret dreams, how he could show the meaning of hard sayings and dissolve doubt. And then notice that she told the king, call for this man and he will show you the interpretation. Now in verse 13, the Bible says, then was Daniel brought in before the king, and the king spake unto Daniel, art thou Daniel, which are of the children of the captivity of Judah? Now it kind of raised an interesting question for me. And the question is this: where was Daniel through all this process? We read about how the king had to call for the wise men, and how he had to call for Daniel. Why wasn't Daniel among the wise men of the Babylonians whenever they were called in? Well, there's not really a black and white answer that's given to us in the story itself. But it is interesting to kind of stop and think about and consider. Why wasn't he known to Belshazzar? Well, evidently he was not in the royal court at this time. Now remember, Nebuchadnezzar had appointed him as the chief or the head over all the wise men of Babylon. At one point in time, he would rank very high up in the Babylonian government. But I don't think at this point in time he held that same ranking. Certainly, if he was the chief of wise men, I think Belshazzar would have known a little bit about him. But he had no idea who he was, and he'd only heard about him by reputation, and that being from the queen herself. Now, what happened along the way? Well, remember way back in Daniel chapter 1, when all these young men are carried away as captives into Babylon, we talked a little bit about the age of Daniel. And most people believe that Daniel was a teenager at that point in time. If he was about 16 years old, whenever he was carried away into Babylonian captivity, at this point in time, he would now be 82 years old. And so he's had a very long life here in captivity. He's an aged person at this point in time. And so would that help to explain maybe why he's not a part of the official court anymore? I would think that it does. Probably because of his age, maybe because of his physical abilities. Daniel just couldn't do what he was once able to do. And one of the things that the Babylonians emphasized was the power of youth. They were all about youth and employing the young, and especially the talented young, in service to Babylon. But it isn't the possibility that age has caught up to Daniel, where he just can't do what he was once able to do. Well, it's certainly a possibility. One of the things that the Bible teaches us is as we grow older, we're not able to do what we were once able to when we were younger. In fact, I think I was talking to Dennis about that last week, and another person too, on that very same subject. But I was thinking about the words of Jesus. I know I use this whenever we talk about this idea in Matthew 26 and verse 41. Remember, he told Peter, he said, watch and pray that you enter not into temptation, for the spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. If we were just spiritual beings, everything that we had to do would be a cinch here upon this earth. The thing that gives us the problem is the physical part of man. It's the flesh. And so we're a twofold being. The flesh affects us just like the spirit affects us too. And it's no secret, the Bible tells us that the older we get, as we grow older and older, that our body begins shutting down. It can't once do the things that we were able to do. And so we need to understand that age is going to have a physical effect upon all of us. That's just the reality of it. There's nothing that we can do about that. There are things, I think about, I'm by no means young, at least in my estimation, but I think back 10 years ago, I could do things and I wouldn't think twice about those things that I did. If I do those same things now, 10 years later, I'm going to feel it. I'm going to think about it the next day. It's going to affect me physically. It's going to affect me mentally. And that's just the idea of growing older. But the Bible does teach us that even though Daniel was aged, he was still serving God in his old age. And so it's not like, we reach a point in a time and a magic number in our age where God says, shut it down. You've done what you can do. Now you don't have to do anymore. Step out of the way. Let everybody else get in there and you just sit back and take it easy. Well, Daniel may not have been physically able to do the same things that he could when he was 16 years old, but he was still serving God and he was still helping other people. Now, Ecclesiastes 12:1 through 5 is an interesting passage when you talk about the description of a person growing older. And again, all of us walk down this same road. I'm going to read it to you. I'm going to read it to you from a different version. This is the Message. I've mentioned it before, but I want you to listen to these words and think about them, and think about the idea of how the wise man describes the process of getting older. In verse 1, he gives us this admonition. He says, honor and enjoy your Creator while you're still young, before the years take their toll and your vigor wanes, before your vision dims and the world blurs, and the winter years keep you close to the fire. In old age, your body no longer serves you so well. Muscles slacken, grip weakens, joints stiffen, the shades are pulled down on the world. You can't come and go at will, things grind to a halt, the hum of a household fades away. You're awakened now by bird song. Hikes to the mountains are a thing of the past. Even a stroll down the road has its terrors. Your hair turns apple blossom white, adorning a fragile and matchstick body. Yes, you are well on your way to eternal rest, while your friends make plans for your funeral. You know, that's kind of a grim way of describing the reality of growing older, but Solomon knew about it. And he knew about the experience of as you grow older, your physical body changes. And yes, it is true that when we get older, we're not able to do as much as we once were able to do. But it's also true that we can still do something. You know, we're not dead yet. We may have one foot in the grave, as Dennis said, but we're not dead yet. We're still working, and there are still things that we can do for Christ. And even Daniel, at 82 years old, he was still serving God. He was still doing great things. He was still doing important things for God. In fact, if you go back and you look through the history of the Bible, you'll find a lot of these men in their old age did some of their best work. Think about Moses when he was 80 years old, when he began leading the children of Israel out of Egypt. You think about Caleb at the age of 85, who was able to conquer the mountains and the giants and take a land within the land of Canaan that was promised to him. And so, yeah, there may have been some physical limitations, but yet they were still able to serve God. Daniel probably couldn't do what he once did, but he was still using his abilities to serve God and help others, even in his old age. And so I encourage us never to get into this mindset of where we say, it's time to shut it down. You know, it's time to quit. It's time to give up. You never give up serving God and helping other people. The third thing to consider whenever we're weighed in the balances is, did we learn the lessons from the past? And as you study Belshazzar, he obviously didn't get the lesson. That was one of the things that I emphasized this morning when we began looking at this chapter. He was an individual who I would describe as being unteachable. It didn't matter what you told him. It didn't matter what he saw. He just could not get it into his head, the lessons that God wanted him to learn. And so what we learn from this chapter is God wants us to pay attention to the past. Notice in verse 11. Now remember, the queen, I think she's probably, I don't know, mother or grandmother, one of those two categories would be my guess. But when she comes before Belshazzar, I think she has a little bit of a reprimand tone to her. You know, she's telling him about Daniel, and she kind of says, these are things that you should already know. You know, these are things that should have already entered into your mind. But she says in verse 11 there of Daniel 5, there's a man in thy kingdom in whom is the Spirit of the Holy God, and in the days of thy father. So your father did this. He goes on to say in the latter part of the verse, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, thy father, the king, I say, thy father, made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. She's emphasizing this. This is what happened in the past. Your father knew this man. This man was appointed as the head of the wise men in all of Babylon by your father. And so I think what she's telling him is, you know, he didn't know what to do when there wasn't any wise men who can interpret the dream or interpret the handwriting on the wall. I think what she's telling him is, you should have already known this. You know, you should have learned from the past that there's a man in your very kingdom who has this ability, and your father recognized that ability, and he appointed him up into the top of the rankings because of his ability. If he would have just paid attention to the past, he wouldn't have been so troubled at the situation that existed before him. It's also interesting in the latter part of Daniel chapter 5, when Daniel comes in before Belshazzar, he also talks a little bit in a reprimandal tone toward him. Notice what he tells him in verse 18 beginning. He says, O thou king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. And he talks about, he tells him exactly what happened to King Nebuchadnezzar. He tells him how God took away the kingdom out of his hands, how he made him to live like an animal, how he dwelt under the heavens, the open skies, how he had dew upon his body when he woke up in the mornings. And he did that, he says in the latter part of verse 21, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointeth it over it whomsoever he will. Now notice verse 22. This is what Daniel is saying to the king. And thou his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thy heart, though thou knewest all of this. You see what Daniel is saying? You already knew this. These facts were clear. The story was there for the taking, but you just didn't learn the lesson. You didn't get the point that God was trying to get across to all nations and people and languages, that he's the one who's in control, he's the one who's in charge. And so it brings up a good point or a good idea. It wasn't that Belshazzar didn't know the story. It wasn't that he didn't know the facts. He had just failed to learn from it. Remember I said he was an unteachable individual? Let's be sure that our name isn't mentioned in the same breath as Belshazzar and being unteachable. Because we could know all the facts. Listen, we can tell you all the Bible stories, right? We can present all the Bible facts that there are. But the bottom line is this. It's not just about stories and facts and knowledge. It's about learning from those stories and learning from those facts. And so he had all this knowledge and all the facts, but he hadn't learned anything from it. And so I emphasize that because, you know, the Bible, Jesus himself, when he talked about the importance of learning from the past, remember when he talked to the generation of his day in Matthew 12, 41 and 42? He talked about how the men of Nineveh would rise up in judgment against that nation. He talked about how the queen of the south would rise up in judgment against that nation. And the point that he's making is this. When the men of Nineveh heard Jonah preach, they repented. These men heard Christ preach, and they would not repent. When the queen of the south heard about the great wisdom of Solomon, she traveled across half the earth, not literally, but across half the earth, in order to gain wisdom from Solomon. Here was Jesus giving them all kinds of wisdom, and they wouldn't even give him the time or the day in his own city. And so you didn't learn this lesson from the past. And so this is going to haunt you in the judgment day. Read 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verses 1 through 11. I'm not going to read that entire section, but think about some of the things that are emphasized there, and they're written down. These stories, these facts in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, they're written down for us to learn something from. It's not just about knowing the facts of the story. It's about learning something from the story itself. But Paul talks there in 1 Corinthians 10 how all Israel was baptized. Well, all of us baptized, those of us who are Christians today. All of them ate the same spiritual meat. All of us eat the same spiritual meat too. All of them drank the same spiritual drink. All of us drink the same spiritual drink too. But it goes on to say in verse 5, with many of them, God was not well pleased. And then he emphasizes in verse 6, these things were our examples. God wanted us to learn from these people. Just because I've been baptized, just because I'm eating spiritually, doesn't mean that I can go out here and live however I want to live and still be pleasing to God. What did these people do that displeased God so much? Well, they lusted after evil things, verse 6. They became idolaters, verse 7. They committed fornication, verse 8. They tempted Christ, verse 9. They murmured and complained, verse 10. And then he emphasizes again in verse 11, all these things happen unto them for examples, and they are written for our admonition. Why are those stories in the Bible about the ups and downs of the children of Israel? They're for us to learn from. They're for us to get lessons, spiritual applications out of. In fact, remember what Paul said in Romans 15 or verse 4 of what he wrote. He said, for whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning. Not just our reading, but our learning. And so why do we have these stories within the Bible? God wrote these things down for a reason. And that reason is so we would learn from these stories. What Belshazzar failed to learn is from the story of Nebuchadnezzar. He knew the facts, he knew the story, but he didn't learn the lessons that came along with the facts and the stories. And so I encourage each one of us to be reading our Bibles, reading these stories, studying them, meditating upon them, learning from these stories, not just knowing the facts of the matter. That's not why God wrote them, just so we'd know the facts, but to actually learn lessons from them. Did we learn the lessons of the past? Well, that's one of the things that God's going to consider whenever he weighs us in the spiritual balances. You know, one day all of us are going to see the handwriting on the wall. The pronouncement of judgment is going to be upon us just like it was upon Belshazzar. We will be weighed in the balances of God, just like Belshazzar was. The question is going to be this: are we going to fall in the same category as him? Are we going to be found lacking? Are we not going to weigh or measure up to the standard that God wants us to? Well, what's God going to consider that day? Well, three things that we talked about tonight. Did we have a good reputation? Did we imitate the Spirit of our God? Did we have a good name among men? Were we acting the way that we were supposed to act while we lived here upon this earth? Was age just a number to us? We know that physically age is going to affect all of us, but did we keep on going till the end? You know, just because we're getting older doesn't mean it's time to give up on serving God and helping other people. And did we learn the lessons from the past? Did we pay attention to the stories and the facts that God presented to us? And did we learn the spiritual lessons that God wanted us to learn from them? Well, the lesson is yours tonight. Maybe there's one here in our audience who has not yet